354, What a Friend We Have in Jesus. Page 354, let's stand and sing What a Friend We Have in Jesus. What a friend we have in Jesus, all our sins and griefs to bear. What a privilege to carry everything to God in prayer. Oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear. All because we do not carry everything to God in prayer. Have we trials and temptations? Is there trouble anywhere? We should never be discouraged. Take it to the Lord in prayer. Can we find a friend so faithful, who will all our sorrow share? Jesus knows our every weakness. Take it to the Lord in prayer. Are we weak and heavy laden, cumbered with a load of care? Precious Savior, still our refuge. Take it to the Lord in prayer. Do thy friends despise, forsake thee? Take it to the Lord in prayer. In his arms he'll take and shield thee. Thou wilt find a solace there. All right, did somebody send him to cut on that fan, or did he do it of his own? We'll cut it off. If it was off, it needs to be off. All right, I'm going to ask Eli, if you will pray for the rest of our service. All right, you can go and be seated. I didn't check it to see how it's blowing, and so I didn't want to cut it on, but if people were hot, I was going to say you could cut it on, just turn it more towards you if you were hot. But he cut it on probably because he saw it was off, and earlier I gave him the job of cutting them on, so he's not in trouble. He's just doing what he thought his job was. Just clarify. When he's bad, I'm quick to throw him under the bus, so when he's not doing something bad, I'll rescue him. Let me mention a few things. One is that Saturday I didn't have the ability to announce what the live stream would be because I didn't really know what exact subject I was going to go into, because I had prayed about it but didn't know exactly which way I felt led. After having prayed about it a little bit more, I feel led to go back to where we kind of left off before I got sidestepped a little bit. We sidestepped to ask the question of should Christians be afraid of current events, and we used that for our last study in prophecy. The next one, we're going to get back into studying the actual pieces of prophecy. And we're going to be looking at the question, and I've decided to ask the question this way of, are the two witnesses Moses and Elijah, or are Moses and Elijah the two witnesses there in Revelation, I think, chapter 11? And so the reason I've chosen to ask it that way is to go ahead and address straight on what I believe and then give myself the opportunity to prove it. Because there are some different views in those. But to be honest, though, the more I've grown in my knowledge of the Bible, if somebody's still teaching that it's Elijah and Enoch, then they're so they need to catch up. We're way too far ahead of that for me to waste too much time back there. If it's still somebody teaching somebody coming in the spirit of Moses and Elijah, I get that. And so that's why in that case, I'll spend a little bit of time addressing why I believe it's one as opposed to the other. But anyways, we'll get into that and study a little bit more. I'll try to give a more definitive answer than I have even in the past, because we've talked about it some in the past. That's why I waited to talk about this one. But I'll try to get a more definitive answer even into it as to what we believe. And then, of course, it's Unique Insights who have a chance to leave your grade at the end of it. The other thing I want to mention is the cleaning calendar. I tried to print it and bring it and put it up so that people would have it to look at it and know what the new schedule is. And my printer is possessed or something. It's telling me it's got the wrong printer heads in it. It's like it's decided after it printed the prayer list, and in the time it took me to walk back in the room, that somehow I must have pulled out the printer heads and installed new printer heads without it knowing, and they're the wrong ones. So I'm not sure if it's something small that I can fix easy or if it's a big problem, but that printer's on its last leg with me anyways. I was trying to let it finish the ink that I have and then throw it away, but me and Stefania may just go get a hammer and smash it in the backyard or something. I figured that would be something he would enjoy, so... I joked with Lori. That's what I would do if I didn't have ink for it. So we never know. Depends on how mad it makes me between now and when I actually get rid of it. But so anyways, the theory is that I'll have it printed by Sunday, or I'll get Rebecca or somebody to print it for me for Sunday, somebody who has a printer. And if that gets that bad, I may have to get help printing bulletins and stuff too. But what I will do is mention some of what I've done for the cleaning schedule. And I'll send also a digital copy probably in the WhatsApp group for people saying go and have it. So, of course, you still have this next week, and I have no idea off the top of my head who's cleaning this weekend, but that's still in July, so that it doesn't affect my schedule. So I don't know who that is. It's whoever's on the calendar still, and they should know that since it's this week. I think so, but I'm not sure. But like I say, she should probably already know. The first week going into the new calendar, I have Lori, and I'm going to have to talk to Leah to get her to help you since Mariana is not here. And also she needs to pick up one extra week in there anyways, because she only had 2 as opposed to 3. So I'm going to get Leah to help you in theory. Then the next week, Rukshan and Gertie have to come back in again, but it's because I actually gave them a fixed week that's their week this time around, whereas last time they bounced around. So now they'll know it's the second week of every month. Then Michelle and Ame, they're still bouncing around because of the fact I try to put them as little as I can on the list just because they travel so far to clean. It's different when you come with a car, because I know you come from just as far away, but it's different when you're coming with a car, and another one when you have to come by train and all of that to do it. So I try to, if somebody only has to do 2 months, I try to leave that for them. And we're this close to being able to get it where everybody only does 2 months out of 4. So I make the calendar for 4 months at a time. And right now it's everybody does 3, and a couple, like there's 2 or 3 people, 2, 3, 4 people do 2 times in a month, depending on how it works. And I'll explain some of that. And then Michelle and Ame are next. Jonas and Stefania I put for the last Saturday of the month, or the last weekend of the month. You fellas have some time before you have to worry about it. And then, yeah, it goes like that to where one person already, you have the next, your month that you get your break is this upcoming month, because your helper can't start your new partner can't start until September. Yeah, I put you to where this is your month off. And then your partner will come in and start helping you the next month. Yeah, you're not on the calendar, so I don't know what you're going to do, because everybody gets a month off, and your month off is this month. So, I mean, you can want to do it alone all you want, but you're not on the calendar. It's like she want to fight with me when she's off this month. But the month of August, you're off. Every team gets at least 1 month where they're off, and yours is this month because your partner won't actually be available until the next month. So, like I say, we're getting to where we're almost, hopefully by the next time we get these schedules done, we'll be able to actually fit it so that everybody only does 2 out of every 4 months. And so that way you would know, like I could do the first weekend of the month or the second, but it's every other month. If we do that, then the calendar will actually be easier to make, and it'll be easier on everybody. One thing I am trying this time that hopefully will help everybody is that me and Josiah are going to take the 5th Sunday. You know, usually at least 1 month, every set has a fifth weekend. So that 5th weekend, Josiah said he wanted to try. He said he thinks he's big enough to help me clean. So me and Josiah are going to try him and see if he's able to. So we'll take that 1 weekend. that me and him will come over here, and I'll call Lori every 5 minutes and ask, where's this, where's this, where's this, and drive her crazy. But me and him are going to take the 1 month wherein there's 5 weekends. Me and Josiah are going to take that. We did that also to make sure that I could help people to have as much breaks as possible, because otherwise it meant that, one other group was going to have to take extra weekend. So anyways, that's what we decided to do. After I looked at it, it was the best way to do it. So that's the main thing. The only main reason I went into talking about it at all was because I wanted people to go ahead and know a little bit before, instead of like this Sunday I posted and the next weekend you have to know, since I couldn't get it posted tonight, that the first person who has to be ready is her. The last people in the month are you. The last person who actually has to be ready, I guess, is you, because yours doesn't roll in until the next month. But anyways, for the most part, everybody's close to what you had before in terms of schedule, or you've got time to prepare, because you had the first week of every month anyways last time. So it's not a change for you. So, all right. Now, hopefully that makes some sense, gets people ready, answer some questions. Let me mention on food as well. Maybe should wait till Sunday to get into sign-up sheets so we get more people signed up. But Aura's got next week on food, and after that, it's empty. In theory, sometime not long after that, some of the people are going to start coming back who are going on holidays and stuff, so we get more people involved in cooking. Or the other reason why it's empty after Aura cooks is because there won't be anybody left. Everybody will be dead and not be able to cook. That's the other reason why the calendar might be empty. But I mentioned that as well on the food. If people can sign up, I would appreciate that. I did 3 weeks. I don't want to sign up right now because I did 3 or 4 weeks in a row from the end of the conference till now. Out of the weeks that have been, I did 3 or 4 of those, once with G's help, and the rest, it was just me, I think, if I remember right. So 3 times I'm sure I did. I guess maybe 4 if you count the barbecue, or it was 3 counting the barbecue. But regardless, I don't want to sign up if I don't have to. And I also understand other people are busy as well. So I will sign up if I have to. So that's the main things I needed to mention. I remind everybody that Saturday, I said we'll be back in the center. I'm assuming, I didn't check, but Ginsey Fest is done by this weekend, right? Okay. It's already done, right? I thought so. I thought it should have been done this week. Well, hopefully by Saturday, Ivago will show up and do something. But anyways, the Saturday we'll go out into the center. We'll give some tracks and stuff, since we didn't get the chance to do that for the past couple weekends. And then the next Saturday is when we'll go to Lummel to give out the invitations for the Bible study there. All right, let's go ahead and sing one more song together. Page 512, Saved by Grace, page 512. Page 512, Saved by Grace. Someday the silver cord will break, and I no more as now shall sing. But oh, the joy when I shall wake within the palace of the King. And I shall see him face to face, and tell the story saved by grace. And I shall see him face to face, and tell the story saved by grace. Someday my earthly house will fall. I cannot tell how soon 'twill be, but this I know, my all in all has now a place in heaven for me. And I shall see him face to face, and tell the story saved by grace. And I shall see him face to face, and tell the story saved by grace. Someday when fades the golden sun beneath the rosy tinted west, my blessed Lord will say, well done, and I shall enter into rest. And I shall see him face to face, and tell the story saved by grace. And I shall see him face to face, and tell the story saved by grace. Someday till then I'll watch and wait, my lamp all trimmed and burning bright, that when my Savior opes the gate, my soul to him may take its flight. And I shall see him face to face, and tell the story saved by grace. And I shall see him face to face, and tell the story saved by grace. All right, let's be turning to Hebrews chapter number 8. Since I have not seen my mother-in-law, I assume don't have to translate. Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, there's a problem with public transportation, so. All right, I guess it's Olga's excuse, too, as to what happened to her up until now, right? All right, Hebrews chapter number 8. We're going to try to finish up the chapter tonight. I say try because it's my intention. I'm hoping that a lot of the stuff that I would like to do but don't have time to get into tonight, that I can look into the rest of my lessons throughout the book of Hebrews and maybe squeeze it into some of those lessons. Because we've been talking about the new covenant for 3 weeks, and we've really not even read what the new covenant is, if that tells you how big of a subject it is. Just addressing the difference between a mediator and a testator took a whole week, and in reality, we still didn't get into all of what we should have said about that. There's some stuff that occurred to me tonight as I was getting my last pass on this message that, I need to probably mention that tonight to show this because I didn't bring it out then. And then last week we talked about what was wrong with the covenant and that Israel didn't keep it. It wasn't the covenant, it was the people. And truth being, there was still some more we probably could have said. I think we covered that one fairly well, though, but there was a lot more examples and stuff that could have been brought out. However, tonight we're finally going to read the new covenant itself, and we'll go back and show you immediately after reading here in Hebrews 8, we'll go back to Jeremiah and show you where this prophecy or this quote comes from. All right, so Hebrews chapter 8, verse number 10 says, "For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts. And I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. And they shall not teach every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for all shall know me, from the least to the greatest. For I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and their iniquities I will remember no more. And that he saith a new covenant, he that he hath made, now that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away." Now I'll focus on that last verse first, and then we'll get into the covenant, because that last verse is his actual point. His actual point is he's quoting to you Jeremiah 31, and he's saying that the fact that God said in Jeremiah, which I brought out last week, that wasn't something Jesus just come out and said, okay, I'm making a new covenant. This is something that had been stated in their religion for hundreds of years before Jesus ever came on the scene and began to preach. So that's why it's important that he uses this argument, because it's an argument that matters regardless of what the person reading this believes about Jesus. He's making a point that their covenant that they have trusted in from the time they left Egypt was never going to be the final answer to their need, because God had already said back in Jeremiah that there is a new covenant. And his point he's making in verse 10 is the very fact that he says new means that the other one is an old covenant. And if it's an old covenant, then it's going to pass away and the new is going to take its place. That's just the nature of things, that when you have a new and an old, eventually the old is replaced by the new. That's just the way life works. That's the way things are. That's what we do. And It doesn't matter how attached or emotionally invested we may be in something. I guess I'm thinking about car because it's the most recent major thing that I changed. It doesn't matter that, like, for my kids, we named the other car. We named it Kari, and they were attached to it. That there came a point where we changed to the other one, and eventually we came to appreciate that it's a better car. Now when I want to compare stuff and talk about how nice something is, I compare it from switching from my Citroen to my Mercedes. It's much nicer. You don't even realize how nice it is. It's the comparison I made between the two grills outside. It's as nice as my one was, as much as I liked it. When I switched to the bigger one, it's like you're switching from one to the other. And it's no offense, it's just two different grills, but I know it is, but it's okay. I still like it, just like I still like Kari. I still like the Citroen. Now my point is that what I'm saying here is he is giving us this idea that if God had already said back in Jeremiah that there will be a new covenant. Now, understand, when he says in Jeremiah, it's prophecy, it's future tense. He says there's coming a day that there'll be a new covenant. The very fact that God says there will be a new covenant showed that something was going to have to change in the Jewish religion and in the nation of Israel and in all their faith and everything. Something was going to have to make a big change by the very use of God saying new. It means that he's not looking to establish the old covenant forever, that something is going to change dramatically for them. And that's actually the whole point of everything he's been saying up until now, is to make the point that Jesus is a mediator of a better covenant. That your old covenant wasn't proper because, as seen in the quote of what we just read, and as we'll see when we go back and read the original passage in Jeremiah 31, God points out that the problem with the old covenant wasn't the covenant, it was the people. That he made a covenant with them and they didn't keep it. So let's go back and actually read the covenant itself in Jeremiah 31. And we'll also get a little bit of context with it as well there. Now, we'll come back to Hebrews 8, so hold your place there. But Jeremiah chapter number 31, that's where we're going to go to first in the lesson tonight. Jeremiah chapter number 31 and verse number 31. This is where the new covenant is brought into it. It says, "Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break." So see, there's a problem. They broke it. "Although I was an husband unto them, saith the Lord. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, saith the Lord, I will put my law in their inward parts, and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord. For they shall know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them, saith the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. Thus saith the Lord, which giveth the sun for a light by day, and the ordinance of the moon and the stars for a light by night, which divideth the sea when the waves therefore roar. The Lord of hosts is his name. If those ordinances depart from before me, saith the Lord, then the seed of Israel also shall cease from being a nation before me forever." Now, look at what he's bringing here to discuss. The covenant, he's saying this new covenant I'm going to make is different because it's going to include a change of heart and a change of mind, which we saw that in Hebrews. You can see that. In fact, I'll read it to you the way he says it in Hebrews so you can compare it. In Hebrews it says, verse number 10, "For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts, and I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people." So you're looking at a change of mind and a change of heart is part of this covenant. Now, you think back to the Old Covenant and make comparisons. The Old Covenant doesn't really contain anything like that. The Old Covenant is, here is a list of rules. You keep my rules, and I will make you a nation above all nations, a people above all people. You'll be my peculiar, my unique treasure that belongs only to me. And we'll have this unique relationship so that everybody in your nation are kings and priests. Part of that covenant included that he would drive out their enemies from before them in the land and give them the land. Part of that covenant included that he said there would be no barren in their land, there would be none sick, all these kind of things, that God was going to make them prosper in all these ways. You're looking at the new covenant, he doesn't say anything about that kind of stuff. The old covenant doesn't say anything about the change of mind and heart.
And it shows you there is a dramatic difference between these two covenants based off of what is being offered and what's being said. Because even, and we'll get to the circumstances of the requirements in a minute, but when you're looking at the covenant itself, God is saying that in this covenant, what I'm committing to, like what I'm promising you, and this is the covenant mediated by Christ. So if we're asking when this covenant is mediated, when it's sealed in blood, we know when that is, and I'll show you some proof of that to add to what we've already studied in a moment. But when we look at this covenant, it's something that requires that they won't fully receive the effects or benefits of it until they reach a time where they as people, their hearts and minds are changed, their sins are forgiven. And so some of that stuff is available now, but the things that show you that this is not something that's going to be fulfilled right now, and Romans will explain that to you in much more detail, so we'll go to Romans 11 later as well, is the fact that he talks about it coming to a point where Israel as a nation, everybody in that nation knows him. They know exactly who he is, and nobody has to teach anybody who he is. They already know. So that's when you start realizing that, okay, this is millennial reign of Christ's prophecy. That's when you start realizing, because that's when every eye will see him and everyone will behold him. That's when all the world will know who he is. That's when Israel will be completely established as a nation so that they have no more fear of the outside attackers, where they're protected and directly under his hand. So a lot of the things in this prophecy you're seeing point to that. Now, you have to be able to connect the dots to get there, because he's not directly showing you it as much. But there are things, the things that make it complicated is some of what he describes are things that are available today to anyone who puts their faith and trust in Christ. So the fact that he changes someone's heart and he puts the Holy Spirit in them, and they have the ability to learn his word and know his word in a way that we didn't have in our flesh and so forth, those are changes that you can see are available to anyone today. Now, where it gets a little bit complicated when you start talking about the covenant is when you start trying to apply the covenant to us, there's things in that covenant that are just really not necessarily for us when we start considering this idea of Israel as a nation and stuff. Now, when it comes to the new covenant, if we just keep it to the idea of knowing who he is, salvation, change of heart, change of mind, change of relationship to God, that's fine. There's nothing we have to worry about in that. But if you start trying to take the prophetic stuff of the millennial reign, then it gets complicated. So we're going to keep it simple tonight by looking at the fact that what the new covenant mostly, and that's why I'm hoping I get into other stuff later in the study. The main thing I want to show you is that the new covenant, as opposed to the old one, is that in the old covenant, it's mostly physical gain. It's mostly, if you do this, I'm going to bless you as a country. You'll be prosperous. Nobody gets sick. None of the women are barren anymore, and so forth. It's, you'll be blessed above all nations, and it's mostly material, physical things. But when you look at the new covenant, there's no mention of the material, physical things like that. The new covenant is focused on their relationship to God. And it begins with a change of heart and mind. It begins with a change in relationship to where he says, I'm to you a God and you are to me a people. And so that's similar to that promise. You'll be to me a peculiar people. But we see also he says similar stuff to the church. And so there's some stuff that has to be discussed, and I'm hoping I can get much of it through tonight. But the main thing I'm wanting to show you up front to understand about the covenant is that the old covenant was focused on them as a nation and on the material, physical blessings, whereas the new covenant is still looking to them as a nation. However, the focus is not so much on their prosperity as a nation as it is on their relationship to God. And there's where the big change comes. And that's why the old covenant, you see, there was nothing about salvation to them in the old covenant. The old covenant didn't save them. They were saved by faith. If you look at the relationship, and maybe I have to be careful about how I say there was nothing about. But the old covenant wasn't to save people. Keeping the old covenant, keeping the law, keeping the commandments didn't save anybody in the Old Testament. You see that as you study what God teaches about it, that people under the law were saved by grace through faith, just like we are today. That the old covenant and the commandments, they kept those to keep a good fellowship with God. You made the sacrifices to deal with sin in your life the same way that today, if there's sin in your life, you go to God and you pray and you confess your sins to him. So it's very important you understand that the old covenant could be focused on stuff that were material and physical because it wasn't about salvation. It was about God choosing them above all nations to use them above all nations and all people. Because you also have to understand that God's relationship to mankind changes from the Old Testament to the New Testament, which is Old Covenant, New Covenant. There's a change in his relationship to people in general. And what I mean by that is in the Old Testament, God sets up Israel like a lighthouse on top of a hill and says, if anybody in the world wants to know me, this is where they'll come and find me. That Israel was supposed to be a nation that followed him and served him so that they showed out a light to everybody in the world, so that just like in Solomon's time when the Queen of Sheba is coming and wanting to know about him, it's supposed to be that they're coming and wanting to know about God. That's actually one of the saddest things you see about this whole thing of the Queen of the South coming to Solomon and wanting to see his glory, is that what she's doing in that moment with Solomon, they were supposed to cause people around the world to do that with God. They were supposed to declare his glory to all nations. That's why in the Old Testament you see lots of verses saying, seek ye the Lord, seek God. But in the New Testament, you don't really see that. In the New Testament, the verses say, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel. Declare the good news to every man. That, go ye first into Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. So, in the Old Testament, it's a lot of seek ye the Lord verses. In the New Testament, it's a lot of go ye into all people verses. Because there is a change in how God does evangelism. And because of that, there's a change in how he relates to the world, in the sense that in the Old Testament, he picked the people, he set them up and said, if people want to come to me, here's where I am. This is where you will find me. This is where the truth is at. Come get it. People didn't do it because Israel didn't do their job, not because God's system was bad. That's the whole point here. The covenant wasn't wrong. It was the people. They didn't listen. If they had done what God had said and they had been blessed the way God had said he would bless them and used the way God said he would use them, then people around the world would have come to see, what is this country where nobody gets sick? What is this country where women are never barren? What is this country? I mean, even you think about Israel today, where people still sit back in amaze, and they don't even have half the blessings God promised because they still don't serve him. But you think about it today, we sit back and we're amazed at this country wherein technologically, I know in my country, we say that usually the military is at least 10 years ahead in technology of whatever we think they are. Like whatever you've seen and you've marveled at and said, whoa, they're at least 10 years ahead of that. You've not seen what they actually have. That's what we always teach and are told. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, but it typically seems to be true. And they say that Israel is at least 5 to 10 years ahead of whatever my country is hiding behind the military that we don't see. So where we sit back in America and look at the military, like, wow, they have a jet that can do that. They can do this. Our military sits back and looks at Israel and says, oh, they can do that? How did they do that? I mean, my point is, you have a nation that is such a tiny nation, has been established for such a small amount of time, was brought out of almost nothing as they just about faded from the face of the earth. And then you have some of the most powerful nations in the world sit back and look at them and it's like, how do they do that? I mean, we were talking about the Netherlands with agriculture earlier, that you have this country that's not very large on the map compared to other stuff, and yet the Netherlands produces more food than just about any country in the world. America is one of its only competitors, and there's a good reason for that. America has much, much more land than just about anybody in the world. So there's a good reason for that. But then you have Israel, this little bitty country in the middle of a patch of desert that produces just as much food as either one of them. My point is, you can see that even in spite of all that's going on, there's still some degree of blessing on them that people sit back and wonder at them. But the intention was never that people would sit back and look at Israel and say, oh, they must have smart people there. Oh, they must have great leaders there. The intention is that people would look at Israel and say, they must have an incredible God there. But Israel never did their part, and so that never happened. And of course, God knew this was going to be the case, and God knew he was going to bring in the church and the Gentiles. That's why it's called a mystery. The evidence is there in the Old Testament. It's just you're not going to know it unless you're looking for it. If you're looking for it, you can see things that he says throughout the Old Testament to show you that the church and the Gentiles and all that is part of his plan. But you have to look for it because it's a mystery. Mysteries don't just tell you things up front. You have to look for the clues. And so that's why Paul refers to these things as a mystery a lot of times. Now, saying all of that, when you get to the New Testament, you have that change wherein Israel is put aside for a time. And this is important because what we're talking about tonight affects people who believe in replacement theology, because you have people who believe that Israel's done with. But God made a promise that there is a new covenant wherein they as a nation, not people who are grafted into the branch like us, but they as a nation will receive blessings that we get a taste of right now. Like right now in a church, we have a taste of this idea for example, our sins are remembered against us no more. We have a change in our heart and our mind. So we have God's law in our heart to a degree. I mean, I think that in His kingdom there will be more. But I'm saying that right now we're seeing some of this stuff just as being saved people in the church because we've been grafted into their promise. Israel, on the other hand, they're not experiencing that. They're still experiencing some of the leftover blessing of the old covenant, I believe, because it's material blessings that they're receiving right now. They are being protected many times as a country. The attacks they go through should have wiped them off of the face of the earth, but yet they're still standing. And so when you look at that, there's very clearly something going on with them. Now, you could say that it has nothing to do with the covenant. You could say that God just knows that the new covenant has to come into effect, so He's preserving them. But you don't have to bless them as much as they've been blessed for that to be true. You just have to keep them from being exterminated for that to be true. That's why I believe that God's promise to Abraham, I will bless those that bless thee and I'll curse those that curse thee, still stands. Because I can even testify in the history of my country that whenever we've had a president that stood with Israel, our country prospered. Whenever we had one that was against Israel, our country faltered. It's always been that way. If you look throughout the entire history of the United States, from Israel being a nation, that's the way it's been. And so I have to clarify, from the time Israel's been a nation. But my point being is that when you look at these covenants, coming back to the heart of it, you have a covenant that the first one was focused on the material things with the intention that they would be blessed above all nations and people would come to them wanting to know what is happening here. What kind of God are they serving that they would have this? The new covenant is based on the idea that when it fully comes into effect for Israel, it doesn't matter. They don't need to go around and teach people who God is anymore. They don't have to go around and teach anybody because Jesus Christ is literally going to be sitting on the throne and the entire world will have seen Him. All the kings of the earth will have bowed down. By the time they get the full effect of this new covenant, none of that's going to matter. They don't have to tell anybody who He is because everybody's going to know who He is. They don't have to teach anything because He says He's going to write His law in their hearts and in their mind so that they have this. It's ingrained into who they are, that they're going to have forgiveness of their sin. Their unrighteousness will be forgiven, and He's going to show mercy to them so that they experience what we experience in salvation, that relationship with God, so that they really will have that relationship now of Him being a God to them and them being His people. So I'm showing you that it would be hard for you to fully argue that we as a church are experiencing everything in that new covenant, or even that the new covenant should be applied to us. It'd be hard for you to argue a lot of that because of the fact that there are things there that point to Israel. Now, we are grafted in their promise, so I think you'd be wrong to ignore it and how it applies to us. Because I do think there's things there you have to connect to us, because we'll live in that millennial reign too. In fact, we'll live in New Jerusalem and we'll be there with Him, and we'll have it. I don't know if you can say anybody will have it better than somebody else, but if anybody has it best, it'll be us. I mean, we'll be living in the heavenly city. So I'm not trying to draw lines or make problems in what we're looking at here between the nation of Israel and the millennial reign of Christ and the church. But the point I am trying to draw is the lines between Israel of the Old Testament and Israel in the millennial reign of Christ. That they're going from a material blessing, a promise of if you obey me, I'll do this, to a spiritual blessing. And you'll notice that the condition doesn't exist. There's not a condition given in that new covenant that we just read. He doesn't say, I will make you my people and I will change your heart and your mind and I will put my word in your heart and I will forgive you of your sins if you do this. Now, we know there is a condition. The condition is belief, because that's what's required to be part of spiritual Israel. And that's where Romans 11 is important to this. And that's why I would like to do a deep dive into Romans 11 as a part of this study, because you can't fully appreciate some of what I'm saying without it. Now, I don't think we have time for that tonight because I've not got into any of the stuff I wanted to bring out other than just comparing the two covenants. But when you look at this, you have to understand that being Israel doesn't mean that you have descended necessarily by blood from Abraham, is what Romans, and I'm simplifying Romans 11 a lot. To be a Jew doesn't necessarily mean you're a Jew physically. It's part of your relationship to God. That's what Romans 11 is getting to. That Paul talks about how that in that chapter there are people who they're zealous toward God. They feel like they're, which I guess probably chapter 10, but he's talking about that there's a people there that they are Jews outwardly, physically. Yes, they are descendants of Abraham. Yes, they're part of the nation of Israel. Yes, they speak Hebrew. Yes, all of that. But just like when Jesus stood before the Pharisees and they could check all those boxes, but they didn't know God, he's saying the same thing is true then as it is today, that being a Jew for them doesn't just mean that you are checking off the boxes. It means that you actually have a relationship with God. It's to know God. It's to have that personal relationship, to have that faith in God. And that's why in Romans 11, you almost have what sounds like two contradictory statements, wherein he talks about a remnant, that there's a remnant who will believe in God. But then at the last part of the chapter, he mentions that all of Israel will be saved. So you almost have what sounds like a contradiction until you realize what he's referring to as all of Israel is that remnant who are not just Jewish in blood, but Jewish in faith. Those ones who are not just Israel because they are somehow can trace their line all the way back to Abraham, but they're Israel because they choose to put their faith in God there during that tribulation period. So we know that's when they'll be called back. Now, I say all of that trying to simplify, like I say, some big thoughts. I'm hoping to explore some of that deeper as we go through this study. If not, then we'll do one more week on this if I find I can't fit it in the way I want to. But what I want you to notice about this new covenant and when it was paid for, when it was done because of Christ being the mediator, even though they won't get to see the effect of it until the millennial reign of Christ, I want you to notice that it came into fruit, like it was agreed upon, I guess is the word I'm looking for, when Christ died on the cross. Now, the reason I say that is because when Jesus was getting ready to go to the cross, you have in Mark 14 that he makes the statement that this is where he's giving the Lord's Supper. He says, this is the blood that's shed for the new covenant. Now, in Matthew 26, he says it this way. This is the blood that was shed for the New Testament. Now, there's where you can see that the words testament and covenant are referring to the same thing. It just gives you a different perspective of them. And the reason I'm going ahead and sowing that now is because in the next chapter that's going to matter, and tonight that matters a little bit. Because I do want you to notice something in Hebrew chapter number 9, verse number 15, as to why I say that you can't just make this about Israel as some people do. Hebrews chapter 9 and verse number 15 says, and for this cause he is the mediator of the New Testament, that by means of death, for the redemption of the transgressions that were under the first testament, they which were called might receive the promise of eternal inheritance. Now, you see that he's saying that it's through this new covenant that redemption has been purchased for people. Now, there is the pointing back to the old covenant even in this, but it's in what he does in dying on the cross and taking his blood and sprinkling it on the mercy seat and sealing the New Testament, the redemption is available to everybody. That's why it's hard to take this and try to just point it to one group. So once you understand all those pieces, I guess the only other thing I have to deal with tonight is to understand this. I said there's no condition to the new covenant. There's no, other than believing on the Lord Jesus Christ, there's no condition of, if you serve me, you can have this. Now, that's an important doctrine in terms of understanding eternal security and everlasting life. Because he says this is for the eternal inheritance. You're to be part of this inheritance forever. It's not something that's going to be taken away. But the other part of this is to understand that he makes a promise there in Jeremiah 31 after he's given the covenant. After he said, this is the new covenant. He makes a promise and he says the same way that heaven and earth are not going to pass away and the sun, I guess he says more so the stars and the moon. The sun, the moon, and the stars are not going to pass away unless God allows that it be so. He said the same way that God made an ordinance that these waves should not overtake the land, that the greater light would rule the day and the lesser light would rule the night and so forth, that all that is working according to his will and his volition. It's according to his desire, that nothing can change that unless he chooses to undo it. He says that he's making this covenant with them and there's nothing that could undo it except for him. Now, when you start trying to look at that in regards to salvation, understand something. God says that he will never take back salvation. In fact, anybody who believes you can lose salvation believes that you choose to take it back and not God. So that actually defeats arguments for anybody who thinks you could lose salvation, because God said if there was a way for the covenant to be broken, it would be because the same way one day he's going to do away with the sun, moon, and stars. That's the only way the covenant can be undone, is if he chooses to do away with it. Now, that is what I believe he has to be saying in that verse, because otherwise you could use that verse to preach that when the sun, moon, and stars die, which is the tribulation period, that the covenant would die. And that's a pretty dangerous doctrine, since none of the promises, or most of the promises in the covenant, don't really come into effect for Israel until after that period. So that would have God doing away with the covenant before he's ever actually fulfilled the covenant. So then God would be the bad guy in that covenant instead of Israel. So my point is, you have to be careful how you interpret what he's saying there. And I know that because I've heard a certain preacher who believes in replacement theology who has used that verse to preach that God's going to do away with the covenant. Now, on the other hand, what I do believe God is saying is very simple, and I've just said it. I believe what God is saying is that the same way, the only thing that can break his ordinance, the ordinance, for example, the sea to overpass the land, the only thing that can cause that is when God chooses to let the sea overpass. The sea's not going to overtake the land. The world's not going to be flooded completely as a bowl of water unless God chooses to allow that. And it's not going to happen because he also made a promise to Noah that's not going to happen. So he's not going to break his promises, is the point. All right, concerning the sun and the moon and the stars, that they're going to pass away. Yes, they're going to pass away, but God also told you they're going to pass away. And the only reason they're going to pass away is because God said so. So in other words, there's nothing that can make them pass away other than the fact that God said so. When it comes to his covenant and his promise, I will not remember their sins against them anymore, he's putting it in the same context. There is no earthly power nor force that could undo that covenant. Only God is the one who could take it back. And he's not said he's going to take it back. He said he's going to honor it forever. So there's nothing then that can take it back. There's no power on earth. Israel's not going to be able to resist this, essentially. That there will be people within Israel who resist. There'll be people within that nation who choose not. But the fact that God has chosen to extend his mercy to them, he's chosen to send the two witnesses we'll talk about on Saturday, the fact that he's chosen that in that period he's going to finally make reconciliation with them, that's something that they as a nation are not going to be able to undo, that God's going to do that with them. Now, if we're talking about individual, every individual has a choice of whether they're going to believe or not. Every individual has a choice of whether they're going to put their faith or not. But that being the moment when God is going to draw Israel back to him, that's something that God has settled, that's going to be the moment he does that. And I believe that what he's saying is that no earthly or humanly power can undo that. The only way in that case you could undo it would be if the entire nation of Israel somehow chose that they were not going to believe God in the period where God has said he's going to draw them back to him. And while theoretically that's possible, I believe God's telling us it's just not going to happen. Now, there's a lot you could argue and debate about all of it if you wanted to, but I think it's really that simple, that God's saying that there's no human power that's going to undo this covenant. That the last one got messed up because humans. The last one got messed up because Israel didn't keep their part. It was dependent upon them doing their part. This one's not dependent upon Israel. It's dependent upon God. That's the point I believe he's making. And I believe he's making it because he's said it multiple times. Multiple times he's brought up the fact. In Hebrews, he says it. In Jeremiah, he says it. And again, other places you'll find where he hints to it or says it, that the problem with the old covenant was not the covenant. It was not God's plan. It was the fact that people failed him and didn't do what they were supposed to do. He says in this period, this covenant, it's not reliant on people. It's reliant on God. And that God's going to wake them up and he's going to get their attention. He's going to shake them until they wake up, is what he's promising. That he says that time of Jacob's trouble is going to be bad enough that it may be a small remnant that wakes up, but they're going to wake up finally. And that they'll finally come back to him in that period. And it's not going to be, like I say, this covenant is not dependent upon what conditions. It's just that they come and put their faith in him. That's the only thing you see attached to this covenant. So when we look at the better covenant, because that's the whole point. It's the covenant that Christ mediated. The one that he mediated would be like to negotiate. The deal he negotiated for Israel is a lot better than the deal they negotiated for themselves. That's the point he's making. What was negotiated by Moses on the mountain was if you do good and you keep these laws, God will bless you. But if not, God's going to punish you and he'll become a burden and a great terror to you. The deal mediated by Christ is one day God's going to wake you up. And when he does, you're going to be his people. He's going to change your hearts. He's going to change your minds. He's going to put his word in your heart. And it's not so much about the material things anymore, but it's about the fact that he's going to change you as a people. And it's not based on conditions of what you do as a people anymore. It's just on the condition that you wake up to faith in him. And so when we're comparing the two covenants, the new covenant is obviously the greater of the two. And that's the point he's making. Now, in truth, the reason why it may feel like a simple idea to say it like that is because the next chapters. Now, we have a pause in chapter 11 where we talk about the examples of heroes of the faith. But other than that, most of the rest of the book, this covenant is going to play a part of it. The new covenant is going to be mentioned over. It's mentioned more in the book of Hebrews than it is anywhere else in the Bible. It's going to be mentioned over and over again. No other book brings it up as much as Hebrews is where it's talked about the most. And so as we talk about this new covenant, we're going to see it throughout the book of Hebrews. And that's why I think we can work in some more of this stuff. Maybe we can try to explain Romans 11 a little bit more. And maybe I can close by just reading a passage from Romans 11, verse number 25 through verse 17. Romans chapter 11, verse number 25 through verse, I think I said 17. Romans 11, verse 25 through verse 27. All right, it says, "For I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery, lest ye should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness is in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. And so all Israel shall be saved, as it is written, there shall come out of Sion the deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. For this is my covenant unto them, which I shall take away their sins." So he's saying this is the covenant we're talking about, when I'll take away their sins, because that's part of the covenant, right? I'll be merciful to them, and I'll take away their sins and remember them against them no more. Now, bear in mind, when he says remember them against them no more, it doesn't mean that God doesn't remember something. It means he's choosing not to use that against you, like in a legal sense. Like, I'm not going to call this up in remembrance against you. And you especially see that in other passages where that term is used. But what he's saying is, I don't want you to get arrogant because of the fact, as a church, I don't want you to get arrogant today because God has set Israel aside, thinking that makes you more special than them. The reality is it was necessary for your salvation that Israel be put aside for a time, that the church be able to exist as it is till the fullness of the church is done, till the fullness of the Gentiles is done, until we reach this time where the tribulation comes. And God says, if you pay attention to Daniel, that in that time, that's when he's going to deal with sin. That's when he's going to reconcile with them. That's when he's going to do all these things he's been promising throughout the Old Testament of bringing them back. And it's dependent on him this time. He's the one who's going to do the work. And don't get me wrong when I say it's not by human, because I don't want you to think I'm preaching Calvinism, because it's not biblical either. It's the same problem you have with replacement theology. It's not biblical, neither is Calvinism. I'm not preaching that he's going to force them to get saved. I'm saying all the work that needs to be done, everything that's necessary for this covenant to come back into place and for them to trust in him, that's on him. There's no human error that's going to be involved this time. It's no human thing. The only thing they have is whether they choose to believe or not. And that's why he discusses there is a remnant there in the first part of the chapter, that there's a group of people who still desire God. They just don't know him. Those are the ones who are really Israel, the ones who actually want to know God. And that's why when he says all of Israel, he's talking about them. Otherwise, you'll have a hard time reconciling the first half of the chapter and the second half of the chapter. So you have to understand it that way. Then when he says all of Israel, he's talking about those who the term he uses for it are Jews indeed. Those who are not just Jews by word or by heritage or by genealogy, but truly within their heart, they have a desire to know God, and they're still open to have that relationship with him. When the time comes, he's the one who's going to do everything to restore it. That's why he had Hosea to do everything. If you think about the relationship between him and his wife, wherein Hosea takes all the work upon himself to restore the relationship that was broken. That's why he even makes the comparison, I was a husband to you, is he's comparing it to Hosea. That's why he had Hosea to marry the adulterous woman who was a harlot, was so that she could be an example of this is what Israel has been to me. And the same way that Hosea had to do all the work to bring his wife back to him, to bring Gomer back, he's saying that he's going to do that for Israel during that period. And then they'll be able to enjoy the new covenant. They'll be able to enjoy all the blessings that come with it. So maybe that's a better way to explain it. That's also why I wanted to bring Romans 11 into it some, even though I don't have time to get into it in great detail tonight, because there's a lot of important stuff there. But the idea is that they've been set aside for a time. They've not been set aside forever, that one day God's going to take it upon himself to do what's necessary to bring this covenant into play. And when he does, that's when they'll be able to really enjoy the fruit and the benefits of it. All right, I apologize. It's probably a disconnected message message. I feel like I was bouncing around every which way, but it's because I was trying to fit a lot of things that should have been spread out probably a little bit more into one message. Father, we thank you and praise you, God, for what you do. We thank you, Lord, for your blessings and your goodness. I pray, Father, that you just help us, Lord, as a church. Pray that you'd help us, Lord, to always appreciate what you've done for us, Lord, and to appreciate the sacrifice that was made for us to draw us unto you, Lord, and for this, the blessing of being grafted into such great promises. Lord, we thank you, God, for what you do, and we ask it in your Son, Jesus' name. All right, I appreciate you being here this evening. Next week, we'll try to go into chapter 9 is my intention. Like I said, I'm going to try to see if I can work in the stuff I couldn't get in tonight into some of the other messages. If not, we may pause a little bit longer at the end of chapter 8 just to go ahead and explain stuff a little bit deeper and a little bit better that I rushed through tonight. So anyways, we'll see how it goes next week, but we'll do one of the two. Either we'll move into chapter 9 where we start learning about the comparison of the tabernacle in heaven and so forth, or we'll stick in chapter 8 just long enough to explain the new covenant a little bit better. So anyways, I appreciate you being here. Take some time to fellowship before you go and enjoy. There's still plenty of food left over, so especially if you haven't eaten yet, make sure you go ahead and eat. But you're welcome to enjoy